ecumenism and US Philippine policy discourse in the early 20th century. But with that being said, I present Dr. Figueroa.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I didn't think I was going to make it here because I drove down from northern Orlando and finally got in, and I ended up going in circles through celebration. I wasn't aware that there were 3 celebrations, I believe. Celebration Avenue, Boulevard, Road, Street, and I kept just going back and stopped 3 times, and I was lucky enough to make it in, and Kathy saved my life, picked me up. So this is, let me preface everything, this is part of a bigger book project that I'm working on. So it's a little bit of academic, hopefully you'll find it interesting. I also would like to lay the background in terms of why I am actually working on Quakers and discourse. This is one of the chapters, in a sense, or cases. I also work on US Puerto Rico policy and the Quakers' role in early 20th century. Again, I focus mostly on the rhetorical, discursive politics. So looking at language, the use of terms in their context. So I do, as I said, as Tony in her introduction, I marry the historical studies with the politics, political science. So I do mostly interpretive historical work. I don't do numbers that well, and I don't do that type of political science. So here, what I want to do is focus on the title again, Quakers, political ecumenism, a term that I'm using to try to make sense of what the Quakers were engaging at that time in terms of the debates post-1898. So after the Spanish-Cuban American War, and the US engaging in overseas management, in a sense. So that's the context, and what I'll do, I'll go back and forth. I like to allow the political historical actors to talk to us. So I do have some textual pieces that I would like to read, some quotes from them as they engaged with this question about US Philippine policy. So first I want to get us into the broader context in terms of the Religious Society of Friends. Personally, I am not a Quaker. However, I do have Quaker sensibilities, and I did my work at Haverford and Swarthmore in terms of my archival work and my research. So I'm originally from the Northeast, even though I was born in Puerto Rico. I lived in New York City and New Jersey, and did my work in, as I said, at Haverford and Swarthmore. So, for those of you who may or may not know, Religious Society of Friends here, one snapshot of what they basically are. George Fox and others who founded the Society of Friends, goes back to the mid-17th century. It's practiced in various forms today. And I mentioned people get surprised that most Quakers now are in Kenya. So the largest percentage of them are there. So it's an organization that has also been involved in various things. Some of the traditional testimonies or principles or ways of engaging the world are seen through various concepts. So social equality, integrity, simplicity, among others. And this is one way that you connect the Quaker sensibility. First of all, how many of you are from the Quaker Meeting House? No? Because I know they were invited as well from Orlando, the Orlando Meeting House. Or any other meeting house? I'm not even sure there's one meeting houses. Meeting house? So the lens in which the Quakers engaged the world politically, socially, and in terms of economic development were through a combination of these testimonies. And we've heard the other types of testimonies, for instance, the humanitarianism, egalitarianism, so various isms that are part of this process that we will see. So here, just to put my case that I will be engaging more in context, you have the various roles that Quakers, both conservative or liberal Quakers, progressive Quakers, have engaged in various forms of social justice politics or policy reform debates. So here are some of the areas, for instance, the anti-slavery movement, first to begin the process of, in the private sphere, in the meeting houses, to talk about what to do with the issue of trade and ownership of people. They moved from the private to the public. The post-Reconstruction era, or after the Civil War, you have the debate about what to do with the freed men at the time, the black equality issue, women's suffrage of the early 20th century. They were engaged in that, prison reform, education reform, the inclusion of non-white people in the meeting houses. So there was always a debate in terms of, we are promoting equality and freedom outside the meeting houses, but then the irony is that you still had segregation in the meeting houses. So it was a dichotomy there that we have to engage with. And then you also have labor and civil rights struggles from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and then environmental issues in the 70s and 80s. So there's a gamut of various policy issues that Quakers have engaged in over time. One of the areas, which is what I'm engaging in, is what I put at the end, the imperialist, anti-imperialist debates over insular territories. So the territories acquired after the Spanish-American War. And the Philippines is one of the cases that I want to talk about. So, this is my site, in a sense. How many of you have been to upstate New York? How many of you are familiar with New Boats? More or less Poughkeepsie, well, it's above Poughkeepsie, but New Boats, New York, where the Lake Mohawk House is located. It's been a resort ever since the founding in the 1880s.
Very expensive.
Very expensive, yes. What is it, maybe 3,000
$600
to above in terms of room? I remember when I was finishing up, this is based on my dissertation work, so when I was finishing up that part of the project, one of my advisors gives me a check for $250. So you can go to the Mohawk House. He said, well, this is not even going to get, it won't get me anywhere. $250 is not enough. I said, oh, is that expensive? Yes. So as far as staying, it wasn't reasonable. So the way that I wanted to discuss the role of Quakers in terms of US Philippine policy discourse in the early 20th century is to look at the work of the Smiley brothers, who founded, Albert Smiley, who founded what's called the Lake Mohawk Conference of Friends of the Indian and Other Dependent Peoples. It's a very long name. It was originally called the Friends of the Indian, meaning the Native American question. And then they moved into the acquired territories and non-white peoples. So this is Albert Smiley. He was what is known as a Hicksite Quaker, meaning a more liberal Quaker, who was one of those unknown social gospelers of the time, who looked at reforming the system, looking at political economic conditions that people were engaging in, and as a way to explain behavior, as opposed to, prior to these kinds of debates, looking at redeeming the individual from the ground up, from the inside out. He focused on conditions, political economic conditions, to try to basically uplift people of all races, ethnicities, and genders. So again, this is the look of the 19th century. So, I always like to start with epigraphs or quotes from those political actors. So here are two from two different years that Smiley basically uttered in his speeches at these conferences to lay out the reasons why they were engaging the question about the insular policies for, in particular, the Philippines. So as you can see, he says, ladies and gentlemen, the time has arrived for the 19th Conference of the Friends of the Indian. I am not sure, but we shall have to change that name. And that became a debate in itself. These friends are friends of other peoples besides the Indians. I cannot begin to tell you how much pleasure it gives me to welcome you here to see a company of men and women with earnest hearts, clear minds, coming together to discuss the elevation of different races of people and the best way of doing it. It is to me an intense delight. I believe all good causes I believe that all good causes can be best promoted by the friendly, earnest, open discussion of people holding different views, comparing notes, and then arriving at some conclusion. We have always had open and free discussion here, and at the end, we have come to some conclusion in which we could agree, owing to the fact that there were peacemakers as well as wise heads among us. It was 1901. For those of you who are not familiar with the Quaker sensibilities and the approach, I put some of the words in italics. Open discussion, community discussion is part of the process. Comparing notes, multiple points of views. So it's a more communal democratic engagement. So this is, you see the hints, he's hinting at it. He wasn't very religious in terms of other types of activists at the time, but you can see it in the language that he's using here. He's drawing from his Quaker tradition, his Quaker background. Then he says, we have always, again, had open and free discussion. That's part of the process. In 1904, then he makes it more explicit as to what the conferences were about. We don't meet here to scold the US government by any means. Our object is to discuss conditions in a candid way and to see if we cannot do something to better them. I think it is the general feeling that we should give a prominent share of our attention at this conference to our new dependent peoples. In these conferences, we invite discussion by people who hold differing views. The only way to get at the truth, again, the truth is a concept that is also focused in the Quaker traditions, is for both sides to be heard fairly, only in a temperate and kind spirit. If once in a while a little warlike spirit breaks out, it generally gets calmed down before the conference closes. So open, you can see how lively in the mountains, Newport, New York, engaging these questions. But of course, you already have, so you may have some questions about this and how he framed it. Okay, so before I get into the nuances of the argument that I'm trying to make here, so here are some of the guiding questions. To what extent did the LMC, the Lake Oman Conference, serve as a clearinghouse of ideas in terms of shaping perspectives, opinions, positions about U.S. Philippine policy in the context of an emerging U.S. imperialist state? The second one related to this is, in what sense did Quakers within the LMC seem to provide a different form of, quote, representative politics, linking policymakers, democratic institutions, colonial institutions, and the voting publics, etc. So, two parts to this process is one, the institution itself as a non-governmental institution / pre-think tank. We think about think tanks in this kind of sense. And the other one is the theoretical notion of representation in politics. This is going away from the normal forms that people think about. Congressional members, among other elected officials, if not interest group politics. So this is a different format, let me put it this way, so we can engage this as well. here, what I want to lay out, argue, claim, is that the Mohon Conference played a special role, allowing, again, American and Filipino leaders at that time, you had Quakers and non-Quakers alike, to utilize this space, this communal democratic space, to again bring together, as which the polarizing and competing racial religious values serving as cultural barriers. So the so-called Philippine problem was defined in terms of values, racialized based on religion, among other aspects. So I will focus on this point and what I'm calling political ecumenism, which is one way of, again, this is where the academic side comes in, trying to find a way of capturing what those who were engaging in politics through the lens of the Quakers were doing. So that's always the question that I go into these kinds of pieces is, what would they think? What were they doing? What were they engaging at that time? Because we don't have Ouija boards, we don't have magic powers to go into the past, so we have to rely on texts, documents, historical figures, archives. So here I frame it in this sense. They were engaging, again, marrying the Quaker testimonies and sensibilities to the politics of the time. So I called it a constitutive, meaning a process that there is no beginning or end. It's just an organic, lively discussion, and you eventually emerge. Something emerges, a product emerges. So here we have this constitutive dialogic process where individuals engage in discursive politics or practices, again guided by Quaker peace testimony and the discernment principle, for achieving universal assent, meaning unity, not consent, but unity, which is we can talk about the difference in hopefully a lively discussion later on, among competing political visions and policy statements. So you have perspectives engaging and also policy statements being discussed and debated. So what I want to do is focus on some of these aspects and get us going on some of the areas of intervention here. So the periods of Quaker interventions through the late Mohon Conference cover these periods. And there are some ways of covering them, looking at them as a moral imperative period, the new progressive approach, granting authority, and then the discussion about independence. Again, as early as 1914, 1915. So what I'll do is go through some of these periods and then wrap up and then have a nice, hopefully, Q&A discussion, debate maybe, at the end. Okay, so it was clear back in the period that I am covering here that the U.S., many scholars have argued back and forth in terms of whether the U.S. expanding its authority overseas is a form of imperialism. And of course, most of them do say that it is a form of imperialism, in a sense of acquiring territories, organizing them, providing a form of identity that was mirroring what the U.S. government wanted at the time. So there's various ways of looking at this. So U.S. imperialist rule in the Philippines lasted almost 50 years or so, 1898, 1946. So during this period, the U.S. had to deal with the social, economic, and political complexities framing the so-called Philippine problem. Although some scholars have quoted the worst chapter in almost any book in American history, And despite some arguing that there is no connection, no clear connection with American Western expansionism, there is a consensus among scholars that both the Spanish-Cuban-American War and the Philippine War afterwards were significant turning points that basically not only fashioned U.S. imperialism, but also galvanized a more progressive U.S. Philippine policy. So this is the moment when these splits begin to occur. So you have between the Organic Act of 1904 and the Jones Act of 1916, U.S. sentiments towards the Filipino shifted from seeing them unfit for political and economic independence to considering them prospects for liberal self-government and beyond. Recently, Paul Kramer, historian, in 2006 identified what he calls, quote, the imperial politics of recognition, end quote, that emerged at the intersection of race and empire at that time. However, there was a more fundamental interwoven racial religious discourse, which I show here, underwriting even this so-called politics of recognition. So I'm saying that it's beyond just recognizing the existence of the other at this point. It was about shaping them. Through the Lake Mohawk Conference of Friends of the Indian and Other Dependent Peoples, we see a different dynamic playing out here. So it wasn't ideologues, for instance. You had conservatives, you had liberals, you had imperialists-minded, anti-imperialist-minded, you had women and men. Women allowed, because again, the Quakers were open to women leadership in the beginning, so this conference also was open to that. They allowed those who were being colonized on the islands to have a voice, so they were invited to come to upstate New York, paid for by the Smiley brothers, Albert Smiley. So it was a very dynamic space. So the Lake Mohawk Conference's form of political ecumenism, which I just mentioned, served to empower national dialogue across party lines, ideological orientation, social-cultural divides, and the so-called public-private partnerships. While both the progressive and imperialist impulses in the U.S. political scene were tamed by pragmatic Quakers' unique experiment at communal democracy. So this is one way of looking at it. They were experimenting with so-called communal democracy, allowing various voices. Again, as Smiley, the quote that I began with, showed, there was also heated discussion, and walking out the room, and these kinds of things, but towards the end, they were able to come up with a unified voice. So let me just talk about the Philippine problem as they discussed it, and then we'll move on to the sections. Here, both the Philippine problem, according to, again, Albert Smiley, he basically said that the breadth and the depth of this problem needed discussion outside of the U.S. Congress and outside of the Bureau of Insular Affairs, the federal agency that was also responsible for managing these territories. They needed serious discussion. His pragmatic politics, rooted in practical lived experience, for example, his previous work with the U.S. Indian policy in the late 19th century, brought him to the realization that the Philippine problem required an open, communal democratic approach that was not readily available within normal politics. The problem had to be pursued with the Philippines' racial religious kind of amalgamation in mind, all these dynamics, which gave white Christian U.S. officials apprehension even after the first Organic Act of 1902 that apparently extended U.S. liberal democratic practices to the Philippines. Within this climate of cultural uncertainty, religious and racial complexity, and again, political consternation, Smiley and his Lake Mohawk Conference provided a more inclusive, cooperative, and ecumenical framework. Again, that was the attempt in trying to bring people in, be inclusive, to discuss the Philippine policy. So there were various approaches, and the first one, again, was this moral imperative. In this case, they considered the question about the Philippines not a political right, in a sense. Again, is trying to focus on the humanity on the ground, but never questioning whether the U.S. had a right to the islands in the first place. So they basically focused on improving conditions on the ground. So the LMC leadership decided in October 1904 to officially turn to considering pragmatic solutions to the Philippine problem through open dialogue. They turned toward the other dependent peoples in terms of insular territorial policies that was basically significant to American Quakers' real progressive commitment to understanding conditions in the various outlying portions of our country. LMC Secretary Phillips, who was also a Hicksite Quaker, a liberal Quaker, recognized that his non-governmental institution could infuse morality. So they thought that morality, the issue of morality, was missing in the way that the U.S. Congress and the federal government was discussing the overseas territories. And he wanted to infuse morality, humanity into the discussion. They were trying, and again, if you try to avoid politics and partisanship in any of these kinds of discussions, you know that you will not succeed, but they tried. He understood that in order to resolve the Philippine problem, reliable data about the conditions facing Filipinos was necessary. So he wanted to basically get expert testimonies on the ground as opposed to from the top-down approach that the Congress was taking at the time. And this resonates with politics today as well, when you think about how the U.S. government deals with overseas or foreign policy, and many of those approaches can be traceable to the various debates and approaches at these early 20th century conferences. So, since the U.S. had inherited these non-white peoples after wresting sovereign control from Spain and later the Philippine elite insurgents, he asserted that the LMC should intervene in a more pragmatic manner through humanitarianism, again seeking to treat those conditions systematically on the ground. And of course, he publicly announced, saying that with all the political and other agitation of the Philippines, reliable information concerning them is extremely difficult to access. And in widening its scope to make such information accessible, he says the Lake Wuhan Conference has greatly enlarged his sphere of public usefulness. So again, he's trying to make an argument that the LMC should be a place for others, including elites from the Philippines, to come and engage politicians, intellectuals. All these individuals were invited in these spaces. Most U.S. officials participating in the Philippine sessions at the conference, who were considered knowledgeable, if not experts in the U.S.-Philippine policy, shared this view of opening up the space, despite their positions on the expansionist question. So both imperialist and anti-imperialist minded, for example, similarly relied on the altruistic, moral, religious, paternalist arguments of their day. Right? The 19th century, 20th century is about bringing up those who are below, to justify control of the vast Philippine archipelago. So here the process is engaging the Americanization process, or the immigrant policy of the time, and challenging it in a different sense, kind of an implicit sense. So Americanization quickly amounted to a form of racial religious uplift politics at these conferences. So morality was infused then, and then in 1911, 1912, you have a different approach, a so-called new progressive approach. So there were two conferences held in 1911 and 1912. that were, I believe, I argue, there were critical points, turning points in the way the U.S. policy development process took place. In 1911, the LMC platform, so what they did, the institution, after having these meetings and these discussions and debates, they produced what were called platforms at the end of that weekend, and they would send these to members of Congress, to public libraries, to educators, to newsletters, to basically say this is what the LMC stands for in terms of the Philippines, in terms of Puerto Rico, in terms of the so-called Negro question in the 1890s. So they had different platforms they produced. So here, the 1911 platform shows a form of consensus between secular and science. Yeah, this is the era of the scientific, the movement to justify different forms of treatment of different people, right, through science or religion. So here you have the secular scientific side versus the sectarian Christian approaches facing at these conferences, clashing at these conferences, to dealing with the Philippine problem. So for example, the platform expresses a more progressive, cooperative outlook by bringing together seemingly irreconcilable views. Yet the platform did more than provide this reconciliatory language. It also signaled the possible new direction of the LMC would take in the next 5 years. So this is the turning point. They started to outline and promote the importance of local government and voluntary associations on the islands. Again, to try to promote fuller democratic practices, but again, within the auspices of the US Congress. In a larger sense, the real hope was to construct a positive political vision that would lead to more political cooperation between two distinctive communities of discourse in the Philippines and Puerto Rico. So here's the part of the platform that I wanted to read. And it says, "We express our grateful appreciation of the labors of our fellow citizens in the Philippines, where, under the united leadership of Filipinos and Americans, a new political society is being created out of people now possessing neither common aims, common customs, nor a common language. No true American desires to see them either held as a subject community or abandoned to become subject to either a foreign power or a domestic oligarchy. When they have acquired a common language and by the practice of self-government in their municipalities and provinces have acquired the habit of self-government," again, this whole habit of self-government language that you saw back then, "and not till then it will be for them to decide what they wish that their future relations to the United States, the US, should be." So again, through this platform, based on unanimity, so it's this unanimous vote, the LMC ushered a new, more pragmatic political solution to the long-standing Philippine problem. By focusing on national character and political competency, it moved beyond the traditional racial religious uplift notions behind the altruistic paternalist policy that the Congress was promoting at that time. So in a in a sense, they started focusing on what Tocqueville. Who remembers Alex Tocqueville? Going back to the 1830s when he makes these comments about the American experience. So they were using that language of, let's get to the heart. Let's make it a habit of the heart in terms of self-government. So they started drawing from that as well, from the classical, semi-classical liberal notions of self-government, individuality. So you see it here with the word habit, making it the habit. Once you practice something, it becomes a habit, then you are full citizen, full member of civilized society, this kind of language. So here, the real liberal democratic practices locally would instill a habit of self-government that become necessary and sufficient for U.S. officials to then seriously consider a full democratic polity in the Philippines. So you have that approach, the progressive slash liberal approach. Then you have the granting authority side. Now you begin to see Congress listening, in a sense, to what was happening at the Lake Mohawk Conference, right, in upstate New York, listening to some of the language there. So you have Congressman William A. Jones, Democrat from Virginia, who would eventually draft the 1916 Organic Act named after him. Wrote a critical letter to the new LMC Secretary H.C. Phillips, who was also a Hicksite Quaker, in 1913 about the list of speakers assigned to the Philippine session. So you start seeing the critiques now, critiquing even the LMC's so-called progressive approach at the time. Jones was concerned that the speaker order would create a problem with the anti-imperialist groups. He was a secularist, egalitarian, anti-imperialist who drew on these pragmatic attributes to guide his work in Congress. His direct correspondence demanded more balance in the upcoming conference program. Again, Smiley had a hard hand in terms of who would speak, at what time, what topics were going to be discussed. So despite the part of the rhetoric of bringing all voices together and everyone becoming equal within the conferences, even the Quakers had a tough time with this balance. So they started getting critiques from the outside saying that, well, even the speaker, the order of speakers, who goes first, second, third, tells you what policy you are promoting or not considering. So his direct correspondence demanded more balance in the upcoming conference program, which he noticed was overloaded with imperialists at the time. So this is part of his letter. I have carefully examined the list which you sent me, and it appears to me as if the discussion of the Philippine question will be very one-sided. Indeed, unless I am mistaken, there will be no real discussion of the merits of this great question, end quote. So Jones sought a fair and balanced process by highlighting the, quote, extreme imperialist views, end quote, on the Philippine sessions, hoping to persuade the Quaker leaders to uphold their promise for real communal democratic exchanges. And then he went on to say, you will pardon me for saying that it appears to me as if you have invited to speak upon this subject a large number of gentlemen who hold extreme imperialist views, such as Bishop Brent and Fallows, Messrs. Worcester and Egan. Some of these gentlemen, such as Edward Fallows, cannot possibly discuss the question from a disinterested standpoint, end quote. So it was well known that Jones was not pleased with the LMC program. Congressman Jones had been a prominent member and participant at the LMC going back to the 1890s, because the LMC was founded in 1883 and it dismantled in 1917. So that's the period that they were engaging many issues. In 1903, in a 1903 statement by another LMC member, L.C. Maynard, it was noted that, quote, the conference has found an earnest and efficient co-adjuster in the Honorable William A. Jones, who is a regular attendant and thoroughly in accord with the spirit of these assemblies, end quote. Jones was therefore well respected and someone to take seriously, yet Secretary Phillips' response demonstrates how committed the LMC was to maintaining its political neutrality, because he responded in a different way. Even in attempting to appease a longtime member, Phillips uses diplomatic language to appease the congressman and suggests that the Quaker spirit and its inherent egalitarian and social justice ideals still fueled the LMC. And this is what he says. He responded to Jones's critique. He says, it is entirely true that we invited a large number of holding what may be called imperialistic views, and that asking a man like Mr. Fallow, we were quite conscious that he would probably not speak with entire impartiality, end quote. Phillips then reminds the congressman that, quote, the basis of the conference was for free discussion of various conditions on the Philippine Islands. And in order to accomplish that, it is necessary to have as nearly as possible all points of view. End quote. Phillips focused more on the broader issues, while Congressman Jones preferred to attend to the imbalance, the various disparities or inequalities that were taking place in terms of speakers and the types of subjects discussed. By arranging the desirable, because they had this selection of desirable speakers list and the expert list. So they were going back and forth as to, okay, who's desirable? Again, coded word for someone that had a particular point of view. And then the expert. The expert could be someone on the island, it could be an American who was appointed to do some work there. So it was very broad in a sense. But all this was managed by Smiley and the business committee within the Lake Mohawk Conference. So the latter, the expert speakers issue, determined how the discussion of the Philippine problem would develop, and more importantly, it would also distort any just and positive outcomes pursued by the LMC. So Phillips tries to ease Jones's apprehensions by directly stating how aware he was maintaining a delicate balance between the imperialists and the anti-imperialist voices at the conference. So here, he tells him towards the end that Professor H. Parker Willis, who spoke last year, and Judge Blunt are among those on your side of the question who have not yet answered invitations. We mentioned this to convince you that we have not slighted those holding your point of view. And if they are not present, it will be from accident or from reasons beyond our control, end quote. So they believe themselves to have no choice but to allow the randomness of the selection process to resolve the imbalance problem over time. Yet later, Phillips suggested that those who were sympathizers of the anti-imperialist view should become more active and take responsibility for their own views by accepting Smiley's invitations more often to present at the LMC. So that was part of the internal discussion, allowing those to have more authority in shaping the policy. And then the last part of it, and then I'll just summarize very quickly and conclude, is what's called the independent, in a sense, discussion. So discussions about the Philippine independence increased at the LMC starting in 1914. Underscoring this goal was the maxim that partnership is good for democracy. So if you become a partner in these discussions, it's good for the democratic process and moving forward. Nothing is more conducive to good administration than a strong partisan opposition. If everybody is in accord, the people will hear all of the good things that are being done, and the evil will be kept out of sight, end quote. That was the secretary from the Lake Mohawk Conference secretary making this statement. In this regard, former Secretary of Public Instruction in the Philippines, also a member of the Philippine Commission and Treasurer General of Persia, and also, of course, an LMC member, William Morgan Schuster, commented, he says here, ever since I went to Manila in 1901, both in and out of the islands, I have witnessed to and participated in discussions ranging over every phase of the Philippine question, from independence to some purely local and economic measure. I think, without naming any particular individual or group of individuals, that it is a very easy thing to be smug and hypocritical when someone tells you that you are being altruistic. We have laid the flattering unction to our souls that we are being truly altruistic toward the Philippines, that if we do not stay there, they will fall into the hands of Germany, or into the hands of Japan, or in some other nation. If we grant the Filipinos independence, they will undoubtedly have some trouble, end quote. So Schuster here, distinguishes between traditional empires and what the U.S. was building through the Philippines. He claims, quote, "The fact that the great nations of the world are today engaged in a life and death struggle because of the colonial empires and colonial ambitions may point to a certain moral for the U.S. The argument which you have heard so often in favor of an indefinite retention of the Philippines under the United States flag are not based on altruism. They are based upon a sentiment created in this country by commercial and business interests, whose right to defend themselves and to take care of themselves I am the first to admit, which mistakenly leads them to suppose that only by controlling the government of the Philippines can we get advantageous markets in those islands," end quote. Schuster does not think the U.S. has any right to retain the Philippines and its non-white peoples. He concludes, even if that assumption is correct, even if increased trade and commerce for the U.S. could be retained only by our control of the Philippine government and the Filipino people, I do not think that we would have the moral right to do so, end quote. So again, he thinks this sentiment is incorrect. When he says, I do not even believe that any legitimate gain, commercial or otherwise, can come to the business interests of the U.S. through our retaining political control there. Thus, Schuster reminds the LMC members that the U.S. has a moral responsibility that transcends economic greed or pursuit of geopolitical dominance. So he's engaging in these debates even back then. So, throwing a lot of things at you. So again, here wrapping up the this session, I try to pay attention to basically the language of the post reading here of those actors who were engaging in these debates. What is very interesting is the role of the Quakers trying to play a neutral role in this heated debate about what to do with overseas territories. So the Philippine case is very unique because it also brings in the issue of religion even more. So you have a Protestant-founded, Puritanic, rooted nation confronting those who are more Catholics, morals on the island at the time, at the same time, or even the non-white. So you have the racial, the religious clashing there, so you have to deal with that as well. And then, of course, dealing with the accusations of imperialism, a different form of imperialism taking place in the early 20th century. So, so what I show here, what I hope I did, was the discussion was varied, very animated at times, but very well controlled by the Quaker sensibilities through what I call the political ecumenism approach, trying to do many things at once, as you can see. Again, if I had 3 or 4 hours, I would be sitting here, but I can lay out more of the nuances of these presentations and speeches. But I'll stop there. I'd rather have a nice conversation and discussion. So thank you for enduring this presentation. So any questions, comments?
What effects did the LMC have on the eventual decisions by Congress?
Not much in a sense. However, some of the language that Jones used, he basically laid out because he was a member of the LMC as well. Jones, who provided the Jones Act 17. So basically, I can only trace just some of the debates, but as far as causality, that is not clear. So it's basically the tracing of the language and how these Quakers were just opening up the spaces for a more inclusive debate that you did not see much of in the Congress at that time. So the effects were basically the way the language was used freely, without getting any fears of backlash. So you had, for instance, in 1917, Manuel Luis Quezon spoke there as well. He was a member, occasionally a member of the Lake Mohawk Conference, again discussing what was happening. So basically, I traced just ideas in that period of time, but my work doesn't go all the way to 1947 or 46 in the mid-20th century, for instance.
Do the Quakers take a similar role today? Do they have conferences or take a leadership role still?
Yes, not as active. The American Friends Services Committee is the most active. They have the Friends National Legislative Committee. So they become more interest group conscious.
I'm sorry, what?
Like interest group politics, they play that more. They make statements about events that are happening around the Ferguson, Missouri, these events that are happening around the U.S. So you see statements from the yearly meeting houses about that, about, again, providing justice. They organize local meetings, local discussions. They provide in the meeting houses, they have program committees, and they try to bring in speakers and activists in that sense. And then the larger, like the Philadelphia Meeting House, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, we're going to London as well, the London Yearly Meeting. They provide statements, basically, to the members.
The Quakers in Kenya and in the Philippines, are they interested in proselytizing? Is that why they're there?
Originally, well, the Kenya experience, originally was a missionaries at the time, so the more conservative Orthodox Quakers who made their way in the mid to late 20th century, mid-20th century. So then that
So if that's
process.
If that's a religious viewpoint, how did it get entangled with the political viewpoint?
But then most Quakers do not proselytize. So and this is one of the critiques as to why the numbers have dwindled over time. Others have said, you should be out there recruiting. So that's not what we are. It's about the individual coming to the light of God. There's different notions on this. So it was originally a missionary process for the Orthodox, and then it's become something different. But it's become a place where a lot of Quakers have found more conducive to these kinds of social justice issues, especially in the African continent. Which is interesting.
Are the Quakers who are in Kenya, are they basically natives, or are they?
Yes. So it's interesting that I haven't looked at all those numbers, but yes. So again, it's the generations from the mid-20th century moving forward. So you have people who are born and raised Quakers.
You mentioned the Roman Catholic influence. I came in a few minutes late. So were the Philippines missionaries Jesuits, or who brought Catholicism to the Philippines first, do you know?
Well, going back to, that's like the Spanish, the Spanish rule. Same
So it was Spain.
Rico,
It was Spain.
the
Okay,
Spain.
it was Spain, as opposed to
The
Hawaii.
Franciscans and others.
Yeah, so it was the Catholic, the Spanish Catholic, versus Hawaii was the American Protestants that were
That took
Christianity
hold
there.
more so.
Yeah. So, and thinking about, Spanish Catholicism was not very progressive. there is a dimension of Catholicism now, though, that is very progressive. And I am wondering how, in your opinion, the work that the Quakers were doing at the turn of the century influences the work of various committees, not just the American Friends Service Committee, but the social justice arms of the Franciscans, or the very many religious organizations now in the United States.
No, it's interesting. This is part of the critique about why the numbers have dwindled over time as far as the Quaker movement is the aligning themselves with the bigger Christian groups, and the various splits. As Quakerism has gone through various splits from 1827 to 28, 1855, 1930, 19th century, early 20th century, mid 20th century, and many of these splits were about theology, doctrinal, and it was this idea that we should then, the Orthodox, then the Orthodox other Christian Protestant groups.
Okay.
Kind of combined in a sense. So we start losing out on Quaker population, and the theology then changed over time, where you have meeting houses or worship that is done traditionally, the unprogrammed, unscripted sense, but then you have the scripted programmed ones with people singing, and which is not the traditional Quakerism, but it's become because of the influences of other Protestant groups over time. So it's very difficult to say, but as far as I think I'm trying to say the first part of the question is social justice. So I think you mentioned the
at this point, in American politics, there is a strong progressive movement that is based in religious theology, whether it is Judaism or Catholicism or Muslim. There is a progressive movement that is grounded in theology and with a moral imperative. And I'm wondering, my mind is trying to track your presentation to what we're experiencing now.
Well, one way of looking at it, the Mohawk Conferences dismantled in 1917, the same year that the American Friends Services Committee was founded. Several of those members of the LMC were involved with this, like Rufus Jones, for instance, and others. I'm not sure this answers your question, but this is one way of looking at the lineage of these discussions and these progressive Quakers. People took different avenues depending on political interests, social interests, and then American Friends Services Committee became a place for many of the similar discussions, but again, moving into domestic policy and some foreign policy, World War I, World War II later on, these kinds of things.
Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. Being from the Philippines now, I begin to understand after your talk how the Philippine government was formed, looking back what simplicity, moral issues. The Philippines was under the Spanish rule for 350 years and was under the American rule for 50 years. 80% to 90% of the Filipinos are Christians, mostly Catholics. And our form of government is democracy. And it's so amazing that Asia, such a big part of the world, we are the only democracy in Asia, Philippines, truly democratic. It's,
Japan? What about Japan?
No, Japan before was, I'm talking about 1946. 1946, wherein to me now, as I look back, there's a lot of influence about the basis Quaker beliefs of morality, democracy, simplicity. I appreciate this very much because now I begin to understand.
So what part of the Philippines are you?
I'm from the big island, Manila.
Mindanao?
No, Manila.
Manila, okay.
Luzon. Now, first of all, I'm very thankful for the United States rule because we are a democracy in which morality, freedom is the basis of our government. Thank you.
What is the relationship of the United States with Philippines?
Okay.
I mean, is Philippines, I'm sorry that I don't know,
No.
but is it totally
Oh, it's
independent
independent,
nation?
Yes.
Totally
Okay.
independent. We gained our independence from the United States in 1946. We were a commonwealth of the United States before that for
30 years, right?
For many years.
30 years.
We are totally independent from the United States, but for many years the United States maintained Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base, which are a very big military part of the United States. So now, we are totally independent.
What exactly is the Jones Act? I'm not familiar with what that did, what that changed.
That basically provided more civil liberal institutions and government on the island. So it was moving it towards more democratization. Early 1900s to 1970, 1916. So it's basically creating more liberal democratic institutions. Again, elected officials at the local level. So again, you had appointed officials from the federal level, appointing governors, and still.
How many islands does the Philippines comprise?
Okay.
Whoa.
Isn't it something like,
The Philippines, before it is, Philippines is called Philippine Islands. We have 7,000 islands.
I thought it was some unbelievable amount.
So
And geographically widespread
if you want
too,
to buy
right?
an island, you can buy it for about 50,000. But you got to be sure that the island that you bought doesn't disappear at high tide.
So 7,000 fluctuates.
Time of day.
It's a kiss week.
This is maybe going to be a totally stupid question, but everything that you're talking about, 1901, 1917, was there any influence of other world activities taking place at the time, Russian Revolution, the onset of war, etc., influencing this?
Yes.
Well, it's not that stupid a question.
No, it isn't. It's just
Yeah, it's that.
like when you do historical truth, it's
Right.
You have to select your area. But yes, even in these conferences, there were discussions about Latin America, Russia.
I was wondering how much that influenced this.
Not in terms of this policy area, but they did have in some of the discussions some references.
Right.
Trying to compare what the Philippines was at that time to other South Asian countries, but I don't tease it out as much as I could.
Okay.
That's why I'm trying not to engage.
But
That's a good question. Yes.
Some influence.
Yes, in terms of the language, when you see those actors comparing and using other world activities, like when he says we don't want the Germans to take the Philippines, we don't want the Japanese to take it. They're referencing other emerging empires. The UK is declined. Spain already has declined. Right, so you have these. This is why they look at it from a geopolitical perspective.
intrigued about the large number of Quakers in Kenya. What concrete things can you point to that the Quakers have done for Kenya? Are there a lot of Quaker schools there?
So
Universities?
they're influenced in Quaker schools, the modernization of the irrigation system, the infrastructures over the years.
When you talk about a largest number, like what kind of percentage are you talking?
It is, so the last figure was about almost 300,000? 300,000? So that's big, which is about 50%, 40, high 40%.
Of Kenya?
Of Quakers in the world.
Oh.
So they dwindled worldwide. But it's funny because people's perception of a Quaker is what? If I say, what does a Quaker look like? What would you say? Well, what does a Quaker look like?
President Nixon.
Nixon, right? White, male.
Slightly more modern omelet.
But then now it's like, no, but you would say it's wrong because a Quaker now is a black young man, African from Kenya. It is the George Foxes of the world. Funny hair. And the guy in the Quaker Oaks is not even a Quaker. That was some. It wasn't there. It was somebody who created some image of somebody. It is no. That's not a real person. So it was just a.
Did you make any connection to the Quakers from Philadelphia?
Yes.
How?
In terms of. Well, that's the.
The LMC, right.
Oh yes, the Smileys were educated at Haverford.
Right.
The Smiley brothers.
Right.
And then they were part of the New York State yearly meeting. So the conferences were held in New York State, so they were associated with the Philadelphia scene.
You said the Philadelphia Meeting House also.
Right, the Philadelphia Meeting House, even the Philadelphia yearly meeting, which is the big one. And so they were associated with the
How much, and I know you're not talking about today, but how much influence do the Quakers have today in that area?
That's a good question because even Haverford is, I think, less than 1% of the student population are Quakers.
And when you say Haverford, you're also talking about Haverford College.
Yes, yes. Even the Haverford School. So
Right.
it's basically. So you see the curriculum still has some of that in there. Surprisingly, there is no Quaker Studies program at Haverford. And they're starting one. They're trying to start one now. They got some endowment, some money from the board to do that. But it's surprising. Earlham College has Quaker Studies.
Earlham?
Indiana. Earlham.
That's Indiana.
That's another big one.
Right.
Indiana. Yeah, the Midwestern Quaker schools still are stronger than where everything started in terms of the U.S. side. Philadelphia, New Jersey.
Right.
I'm from the Haverford area, and I can say that you don't hear much about Quakers at all in that area. You do hear maybe some small elementary schools, that sort of
Yes.
thing, but not much else.
At the Haverford School.